Thank you very much, Claire. So as Claire's just said, my name is Rhys Sandow, and I'm a lecturer in social linguistics in the department. So I'm going to be talking to you over the next 20 minutes or so on a talk entitled Language Diversity, Inverted Style Shifting in Anglo-Cornish Dialect Lexis. So let's just break down that title a little bit. So firstly, we're thinking about language diversity. Now, we're thinking specifically about diversity within language. So we're focusing just on the English language at the moment here. We're thinking about production of linguistic usage, so the way in which people actually use language, but also diversity in the way that people perceive it, or attitudes that people may have towards language and language variation. Now, the main focus of the talk today is going to be on the way that individual speakers can vary in their use of language in different contexts. And this is what's meant by style shifting in the title. But what I'm going to be talking about is a particular finding in my PhD research, which I completed a couple of years ago, which is essentially the exact opposite of what's typically taught in sociolinguistic textbooks and what is typically thought about the way in which style shifting happens. And I'm working on a particular variety of English that is Anglo-Cornish. So that's the variety of English spoken in Cornwall. And I'm focusing, as Claire said, on vocabulary. So that's lexical variation. So let's start off just with some background. So what we know about language variation and change. What we know is that it's a very natural feature of healthy languages, right? So something that occurs in any language variety that we may wish to observe. And we also know that variation can be caused by a number of different factors. So these factors could be language internal. So it could be something to do with, for example, the type of sentence that a feature occurs in. So is it in a declarative sentence or an interrogative sentence? We could also think about social factors, which we'll be doing a little bit today. So things like social class, gender, age, and also the primary focus of today's talk, which is on stylistic variation. So as I mentioned earlier, variation within the same individual in different contexts. So starting off by thinking about social factors. So we know that language varies according to geography. This is one of the things that we've known about sort of for the longest time, thinking back to dialectology studies back to the 19th century, for example. What we've got here is a figure which demonstrates the changing use of what's called rhoticity. So this is the way in which people pronounce the word, like arm. Do they say arm or arm? Now, in the 1950s, what we can see here, and this is data collected from the Survey of English Dialects, we get a much higher proportion of rhoticity, particularly in the southwest, but also in pockets sort of in the northwest and northeast as well. But in 2016, this has certainly become less common. So this is language change that we've got here over this sort of 65-year time period. But what we know is that not everybody within the same community speaks in the same way. So we can unpack this sort of geographical data in a number of different ways. So one of the things we might want to do is consider other social factors other than region. So social class, gender, age, and also regional identity, which I'll be talking a little bit about today. And what we know is that these processes of linguistic change are mediated by these social factors. So some groups may be more advanced in a change and others may be slightly more conservative. So thinking about stylistic variation, and we've just spoken about social variation. So one of the general sort of principles that we know to be true in sociolinguistic studies is that there are no single style speakers. So what this essentially means is that there are no people who speak in the same way all of the time. We all vary the way that we speak according to a number of different factors. And one of the most studied aspects of this variation is something known as attention to speech. And what essentially this means is that we vary the way that we speak depending on how much sort of focus we have on the language that we're producing. So typically, the finding which is attested in various sociolinguistic studies and is discussed in all sociolinguistic textbooks is that what happens as we pay more and more attention to our speech is that we start using fewer and fewer examples of non-standard variants. So here we have a figure which demonstrates the pronunciation of ing at the end of words. So it's comparing pronunciation like running with a pronunciation like running. And what this figure shows is that as people pay more attention to their speech, moving into careful speech styles, and then even more careful speech, which is a read passage of text, they reduce the extent to which they use that run-in pronunciation, and therefore increase their the amount of times they use the running pronunciation. So this is typically what we know about attention to speech and the way that people vary their speech according to attentional load. There are also other ways of thinking about stylistic variation, such as accommodation theory, that we won't have time to go into today. So one of the things that I want to talk about, in addition to the purely quantitative patterns of language variation that we observe, is the way that people perceive language. Now, one of the sort of most widely talked about ways of perceiving language can be described as something known as a standard language ideology, which is defined by Lippy Green here, which I won't read out in its entirety. But essentially, this quote says that the speech used by the upper middle class, and which is legitimized by dominant institutions of the state, tends to be the variety that people perceive to be correct, or they perceive to be better than other alternative, maybe non-standard ways of speaking. So in the context of England, what this often means is that standard Southern British English is often perceived to be correct or better than other, particularly regional varieties. And I think this attitude can account for a great deal of stylistic variation. So we've seen from previous examples the way that people shift towards the standard in careful speech styles. So in their view, maybe they're talking in a way that's more correct or better when they're really focusing on the way that they're using language. So I think it's also really important to think about the way that people perceive a range of different accent varieties. Now, I'm not going to talk a huge amount about this figure here, but if you do want to know more about it, Dom Watt talks about it in his toolkit presentation talk from a couple of years ago. So that's available on the website if you do want to know more. The thing that I really want to focus on here is the second label here, which is essentially when people are asked to evaluate their own accent or the accent of their local community, they tend to evaluate it really highly, quite positively. Only RP here is evaluated more positively. And what this really shows is that people do have quite a strong sense of accent loyalty. So whereby other communities sort of looking at an accent may perceive it in various negative terms, actually people have very strong positive feelings towards their own accent. And that's something that I'm really interested in. So I've mentioned a little bit about the way that people use language already today, and then I've also mentioned a bit about some of the ways in which people perceive language. Now, I don't think these two factors are independent. I think they're two sides of the same coin. So only by understanding both production and perception can we really understand sociolinguistic variation in terms of the pure quantitative distributions, but also in terms of our understanding of why we get the kinds of sociolinguistic patterns that we do. So for my research, the key question I'm interested in answering is what patterns of stylistic variation emerge when a community largely doesn't conform to this standard language ideology. So we've seen what happens when a community largely does conform to this standard language ideology, whereby people shift towards this standard variety in more careful speech. But what about when they don't conform to this standard language ideology? So the study that I conducted. So I'm interested in, as I said at the beginning of this talk, lexical variation in the Anglo-Cornish dialect. The study that I talk about here involves interviews conducted by me with 80 speakers from Cornwall, and this sample of speakers was balanced for age, gender, and social class. And I also used an identity questionnaire to explore and to quantify participant strength of Cornish identity. I'll show you this questionnaire in a moment. And I discussed data today from 4 variables. I consider them sort of in the aggregate. I don't consider them individually in this talk. So the variables that I investigate are, so we've got woman, and in the Anglo-Cornish dialect, alongside a range of sort of pan-English alternatives, we have the word maid, which is found in many dialects in the southwest of England. We have lunchbox, which in the Anglo-Cornish dialect can be lexicalized as either crib box or crouse tin. We have walk, which can be lexicalized as stank. And we also have tourist, which can be lexicalized as emmet. So these are the 4 variables that I'm interested in today. So just a little bit of background about the context in which the research was conducted. So Cornwall. So I'm sure many of you are aware that Cornwall is situated at the extreme southwest of Great Britain. So it's there on a map. And specifically, the research was conducted in 2 towns in Cornwall, which are Camborne and Redruth, which are circled on the map that you see there. And I'm from Redruth, which is important to know in the context of the data collection here. So I'm sort of an in-group member of the community in which I collected the data. So Cornwall traditionally is known for its mining exploits, particularly copper and tin. And here you see an example of tin miners from the Camborne Redruth area. However, the mining industry declined really from the end of the 19th century, and the last mine in Cornwall closed in the late 1990s. So in recent years, rather than being known for mining, it's become more and more known as a tourist destination, and it's become more and more reliant on the money of tourists for its economy. Cornwall is also known for its sense of local pride, and specifically this local pride can manifest in a number of people as sort of an anti-Englishness or some kind of opposition to England and Englishness. And this is reflected in this graffiti that I saw while I was conducting my fieldwork in Redruth. So you see here that it says "Free Cornwall," and essentially this is a reference to Cornish nationalism and a desire to be free of the perceived shackles of Westminster. Now, the word below it you may not be familiar with. The word below it is Angove. And this is a reference to Michael Angove, who led a rebellion in 1497 against the king, who was attempting to raise taxes in order to levy the funds for a war against Scotland. And Michael Angove, alongside many other people, said that, this isn't my war. I'm not interested in your dispute with Scotland. We're a separate entity down here in Cornwall. We don't want to be paying for this war. And Michael Angove and many others marched to London to protest about this. Unfortunately, he ended up being executed and sort of martyred as this figurehead of this sort of Cornish resistance movement, which we still see today in this graffiti. So I mentioned earlier that I conducted an identity questionnaire as part of this study. And essentially what this involves is 10 statements, and participants are asked the extent to which they agree with these statements. Some of the statements are directly and explicitly linked to Cornish identity. So things like, I'm proud to be Cornish, and I wouldn't want to be from anywhere else. We also think a little bit about the way that people react in terms of voting patterns. So statement 3 here relates to parliamentary candidates and whether or not people be more likely to vote for someone who is from their local area to be their MP. But we also have a question relating to a performer on a talent show. So we see sort of very formal and then a more informal context of these sort of voting patterns. And this was used as a proxy for strength of local identity. So the responses were quantified. People with a high score were contrasted with people with a lower score. And I was interested to see whether or not that had an effect on linguistic variation as well. So data collection, how did I collect data? So I mentioned earlier that I'm interested in stylistic variation and particularly attention-based stylistic variation. So a casual style of speech was elicited from spot the difference tasks, such as this one. So the idea here is that participants are engaged in completing this task. Their attention, their focus is on spotting the differences. Yet in doing so, they need to lexicalize or name the concepts that I'm interested in. So for example, I'm interested in the concept of lunchbox. And we see here between the frame on the left and the frame on the right, that the lunchbox is turned slightly in its position. So in order to complete this task, participants need to say something like the lunchbox in a different position, or they may use the local variant, the crib box is in a different position. So here, the idea is that this is a relatively casual style of speech where participants' attention isn't particularly focused on their language use. This contrasts with a naming task where participants are told, right now I'm really interested in the words that you're using, and all they have to do is complete a very simple carrier phrase. So this is a lunchbox or crib box. So the idea here is that there's a contrast in terms of attention to speech between the casual spot of difference task and the careful naming task here. So the results. So I'm starting off by talking about the results in terms of the social variation. So the key findings are that age and strength of Cornish identity were very strong predictors of the usage of these Anglo-Cornish words that I'm investigating. So what we see in this figure here is the social variables that I'm interested in, so age, identity, class, and gender. And then we also have mean number of Anglo-Cornish words used by people in these categories. So as I mentioned, age and identity were the two factors which were statistically significant. So we can see that people under the age of 30 use on average 0.4 local dialect words, whereas those over the age of 40 used on average 1.15 Cornish dialect words. So you can see this is a big difference. This also applies to the strength of Cornish identity, where those who have a strong sense of local identity or a high identity questionnaire score averaged 1.2 local dialect words, as opposed to 0.22 for those with a less strong sense of local identity. So yeah, older speakers and those with strong local identities were more likely to use Cornish dialect words. But gender and socioeconomic class did not have any statistically significant effects here, even though there is differences there, but they weren't significant. So in terms of stylistic variation, we see a great deal of stylistic variation. So I just realized that this figure is the wrong way around. So the labels for careful and casual style should be the other way around, which would tell you that actually the local dialect words were much more common in careful speech, not in casual speech, as would be predicted by sociolinguistic theory or by the sort of sociolinguistic textbooks we might read. So what we get here is an inverted pattern of stylistic variation, whereby the local dialect words are way more common in careful speech, which is an inverted style pattern, as I said. So the opposite pattern to the one we might predict. And this pattern isn't specific to my study or to vocabulary. It's been attested in a number of recent studies in Cornwall. So by Holly Dan on the way that people in Cornwall pronounce the Bath vowel, and also rhoticity. So the kind of example we saw earlier in arm versus arm. So why do we get this inverted pattern in Cornwall? So I account for this pattern by introducing a slightly different way of thinking about attention-based stylistic variation. And I introduce an attention to self model of style. And the idea here is that this model doesn't just consider language in isolation. It doesn't just consider people using language they may perceive to be correct or incorrect, but it's about a much broader system of identity construction. And in the context of Cornwall, people are constructing Cornish identities, because for them, sounding Cornish is much more important than sounding either educated or sounding posh, or various other social meanings we might attach to the standard language. And what I argue is that when people are paying greater attention to their language use, they're also paying greater attention to the social identities that they are either constructing in a context, or if they're reflecting those identities possibly as well. And what I argue is that speakers who have a very strong sense of local identity, it's these individuals really who are projecting these local identities by using local words in careful speech styles. What's also important to recognize is that identities are very much patchwork, right? We don't just have one identity that we align with, but there are multiple identities that we align with, any of which at any particular time we may wish to perform or stylize or construct. And in the context of these social linguistic interviews with me, who is a local person, and that all participants knew that, it's the Cornish identity that may be the most meaningful in that particular interaction, and therefore we get these local dialect words being used to stylize these Cornish identities. So I also want to take a moment to think about what the participants had to say. So I engaged with these participants in discussions about the Cornish dialect and when and how it's used and who it's used by, etc. And they very much, their interpretations of how it's used were very much consistent with the quantitative data that I collected. So they said things such as the Anglo-Cornish dialect is reflective of a Cornish identity. It's an identity statement. People use the word emmet to advertise their Cornishness. Using the word maid accentuates your Cornishness. Emmet is a word that is being used more and more as a flag of Cornishness. And Anglo-Cornish dialect words are becoming the badge of a Cornishman. And people use the Cornish dialect to advertise their Cornishness as a sort of Cornish badge of honour. So the findings from this study were very much consistent with the participants' experiences of the Anglo-Cornish dialect in the real world. So one question you may have is, well, if these people really want to stylize these Cornish identities, why aren't they doing it all the time? Why don't they just use Cornish dialect words all of the time? Clearly they're not doing it all the time, because in casual speech they were using very, very limited numbers of Cornish dialect words. One of the key reasons that I argue contributes to this pattern is that people are very much aware that there is a stigma attached to the Cornish dialect, which is held by many people. So in general day-to-day interactions, they may want to avoid using particular words or pronunciations that they fear may lead to some kind of stigma. Another factor is due to simple intelligibility. So there's a high number of in-migrants to Cornwall, particularly from the southeast of England. Now, these dialect words are going to be unintelligible to these people. People from London and southeast aren't going to understand these local dialect words, and therefore they may, over time, stop using them because it's not conducive to a sort of successful interaction. But in particular contexts, with me as a Cornish interviewer, where they know that Cornishness is going to be positively evaluated, they are then keen to communicate the Cornishness of these Cornish dialect words. So just to finish up, really, we've got some discussion. I argue that style, contrary to what many other scholars have argued in the past, isn't situated on a single continuum, but it's something that's much more dynamic. There are a number of different ways in which we can style shift, even in the context of shifting levels of attention, depending on which identity we want to stylize in a particular context. I've also mentioned that identity isn't something monolithic. It's definitely multidimensional and patchwork, and we can pick and choose as and when we stylize particular types of our identities. And I argue that speakers are more likely to stylize desirable identities when their attention to self is elevated. And for some speakers, in my study at least, being Cornish was more important than being perceived to be either educated or posh, or the other social meanings we might attach to the standard language. The style pattern that we get here is a consequence of opposing forces of stigma attached to the local variety by many people, but also this sort of locally meaningful prestige that we also attach to it. So finally, we've got a couple of takeaways. So language attitudes and ideologies are very much tied to linguistic usage. I mentioned earlier in the presentation that I consider these to be sort of two sides of the same coin, attitude and usage. So speakers who sort of subvert this standard language ideology are those speakers who are more likely to exhibit this inverted pattern of stylistic variation. And then lastly, And I think this is one of the fundamental things that we can learn from sociolinguistics, is that language variation can tell us stories about who we are and who we want to be. And I think this study here illustrates that quite nicely. Okay, thank you very much. And I very much welcome any questions.